Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three martinis coming up.
Hey, really glad you're with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Jim Garrity once again joining us near the 2024 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. So far, he has survived the experience.
I was going to say, one of the non-stories of this convention is that there's been very little in terms of protest, certainly nothing would have been expected. Now, because the family members of the Hamas hostage spoke last night, there are some folks who are like, we really should have a pro-Palestinian speaker from tonight. There's not one on the schedule. So if any day something's going to happen, it might be today. I don't think, so far it's been nothing, or next to, I know they had 56 arrests, but like, that's almost standard pro forma for a political convention. So stay tuned. National Review's Jeff Blahar will be out in the middle of it, and not me. So
good job on landing that assignment. We've got three martinis. None of them are good. Just real quick last night, Jim, I don't know if you got this impression the same as I did. There was strong praise for Bill Clinton last night. I thought he sounded old and meandering for the most part, at least compared to his old self.
Yes.
I don't know. That's what kind of struck me from his speech. That and the fact that he went on too long and he pushed the schedule back, which is nothing new for Bill Clinton at a convention.
No, it was shorter than 1988. That much we can give him. And let me just say, you listeners of this podcast know the high regard we keep Bill Clinton. But as a Generation Xer, watching Bill Clinton look and sound really old was a little bit frightening. Because as one of my friends texted me, God, it's amazing Bill Clinton looks so old and we all look the same as we did back in the 90s. And so I felt just a molecule of sympathy. And then it went away because remember during Me Too, everybody's like, wow, yeah, that really was bad. The president of the United States should not be banging interns. That is an abuse of power. That's not what, even if it's consensual, that is such an imbalance that you really shouldn't be stuffing your underlings when promising to help get them jobs with, Vernon Jordan and all that stuff. And then we're just like, oh, well. And then they treated him and let him be, okay, come back on the stage. He was never a concise speaker. I described it as Joe Namath playing for the Rams. The arm is gone. The energy is gone. He just can't do it the way he used to. And it's a little bit sad. And but also apparently last night was his 12th convention. 12!
Yeah, he said 1972. He's been at every one starting in 72. So
he's spoken at 12. That's the other thing is that, in fact, ironically, he's still talking as we tape this podcast.
Oh, man. And he actually played the age card last night. You mentioned the Vietnam card. Now they're also playing the age card. Yeah. Biden was fine until the debate on the age, but now Trump's 78.
Bill Clinton, who left office 23 years ago, is 3 years younger than Joe Biden.
Yes. Yes. All right, let's get on to our martinis now. Certainly not a good one. You devote much of the morning jolt today to Tim Walz. The two Tim Walzes, really. The one that they're trying to portray at the convention. Pushed me out of the snowdrift, Tim Walz. Football coach, caring teacher, Tim Walz. Versus the aggressively far-left governor, which is also in contrast to the more moderate congressman that he had been in more of a swing district. But as soon as he was elected governor in a blue state, he went far, far left. We've talked about the snitch line for COVID. We've talked about the lockdowns, which included his own mother right after heart surgery. We've talked about his aggressive abortion policies and on and on. And so you do an excellent job in the jolt of comparing his real record with what they want us to believe from the convention. But then there's also a couple things specifically from the speech last night. First of all, this from the video introducing him.
And served 24 years in the National Guard, rising to command sergeant major.
Well, that's one of the major contention points is that he never actually reached that rank because he left the National Guard, supposedly once he knew that his unit was about to be deployed to Iraq. He went on, thankfully, given the late start time, a relatively short vice presidential speech. I think it was only about 15 minutes. But in addition to talking about how the Democrats are the party of freedom, which we'll talk about a lot more in the second martini, because that is quite the gaslighting. Here's what he said is what the Trump administration, if he's elected again, would actually mean for America.
And we know if these guys get back in the White House, they'll start jacking up the costs on the middle class. They'll repeal the Affordable Care Act. They'll gut Social Security and Medicare. And they will ban abortion across this country with or without Congress.
Well, Trump has said he's already not going to do that. The only gutting I want to see when it comes to Social Security is the guts to actually address it and reform it. But he's talking about Project 2025. We know that Trump in his first 4 years wanted nothing to do with entitlement reform and that kind of stuff. So what do you make of Tim Walz, the DNC version versus Tim Walz that's actually got a record?
It's just strikingly shameless. The irony is you would think Donald Trump would give his opponents more than enough material to denounce him and say, this guy's going to be a bad president. You don't want to go back. The fact that they have to make up things is bizarre. You should have enough. Why would you just say, oh, he's going to, like they say, he's going to gut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. No, that's the problem. The problem is that he's not going to do that. The problem is that he said all of these things are off limits and we're not going to touch this. Tim Walz, stop trying to sell me on Donald Trump. Okay, this is it. The second thing, he's going to ban abortion. Again, as a pro-lifer, we wish he would. No, he's already said, I don't like the Florida law. Honestly, he had, it's just too absurd. One, he has watered down the Republican Party's position on the issue of abortion considerably from when he was running in 2016. Now, you could maybe argue there's a little bit less urgency to that with the Roe versus Wade overturn. But notice the Democratic position is that this guy, also there's a reference to wanting to ban birth control. Yeah. There's nobody, the other thing is the claim that Republicans want to get rid of in vitro fertilization, which, by the way, was not the procedure that the Walzes used. It was a different one. It was not one that did not involve the creation of fertilized embryos. There was a group of Republicans in Alabama who want to do it. I think there are a whole bunch of conservative Republicans who are like, you know what? We have problems. We don't like to, we have problems, but we don't really see that as a priority. And in fact, we know there are a lot of beautiful children who've been born through in vitro fertilization. We don't want to, we know this brings children to families that desperately want to have them. This is not something we're intending to do. But, that position by a bunch of Republicans in Alabama is now projected onto the entire Republican Party left, across the country. First of all, this is like one of the first things Tim Walz says is this little jab at people going to Yale.
Now, I grew up in Butte, Nebraska, a town of 400 people. I had 24 kids in my high school class, and none of them went to Yale.
If you're like me, Greg, wait a second, the Democrats don't like the Ivy Leagues now? All of a sudden they're like, these Yale grads. First of all, I'd love to know how Bill Clinton, Cory Booker, and Amy Klobuchar, who all spoke last night, how did they feel about this shot of these eggheads from Yale? Because all of them went to Yale. In today's Morning Jolt, I go through all the prominent Democrats, Hillary Clinton, Sonia Sotomayor, who all went to Yale. And now all of a sudden, these Yale grads. Secondly, this philosophy major. Let me point out, J.D. Vance studied philosophy at the Ohio State University. If you don't call it the Brutus, the mascot, appears from behind a tree and throws Buckeyes at you. So that's why I always call it every time the opening of the NFL games, Garrett Wilson, the Ohio State University. It's always how they do it. So, but he went to Ohio State. Do you think of Ohio State as a particularly snobby, egghead university or something like that? No offense to anyone at the Ohio State University. And then secondly, so he went to Yale for Yale Law School, right? Again, this has never been a problem in Democratic circles ever, right? But the one time they have a guy who went to a small college in Nebraska and Republicans have a guy who went to Yale, all of a sudden they're the populists and they're these dang elitists telling us that. And then he takes a shot at for being a philosophy major. Greg, when's the last time you ran into a conservative philosophy major? I know they exist. J.D. Vance probably counts as one of them, but he's got to be 1%, 2%. I looked it up. Apparently, close to 80% of philosophy majors feel positively about socialism and communism. This is the most left-wing group of people. And now all of a sudden, Tim Walz, these philosophy majors. This is your base, man. What are you doing? Who are you trashing? So that was just a very weird start to it. And it's just, the moment there's a Republican who went to an Ivy League school, now Ivy League schools stink. But then just generally, I know that every convention speech is designed to promote the nominee. And people didn't know Tim Walz very much before he was selected. He's had gushing coverage for about 2 weeks now. But the one thing people might have some memory of or something, what's the biggest, most consequential thing that happened in Tim Walz's time as governor?
The riots.
Right, the George Floyd riots, right? And his performance, really not that great. I know in a circumstance like this, you're always going to get the local city government pointing fingers to the state government and vice versa. But the fact remains, the riots started one night, and it took a day and a half for Walz to authorize sending out the National Guard. And in that time, the cities were burning. People were terrified in their houses. And like there were no police, there were no fire, there was absolute anarchy in the streets. This was an utter failure. You know who called it an utter failure? Tim Walz. I wrote this morning, and I know they say don't look at the comments, but somebody's like, I can't, NR is going with these accusations. No, these aren't accusations. These are proven known facts, right? This is when the rioting started. This is when Tim Walz decided to send out the National Guard 36 hours later. A lot happened in that 36 hours. Whole lot of damage. Whole lot of people got injured. Whole lot of people got hurt. And the idea is he went out there and he said, we invested in crime-fighting technologies. Yeah, just not riot-stopping technologies, right? It's just this, utter shamelessness to pose as a crime fighter when the most significant act of your governorship was to utterly drop the ball in a true crisis. Hopefully Kamala Harris lives a long and healthy life. But if she becomes president, God forbid something happens and Walz is in the Situation Room, is it going to take him 36 hours to decide, yes, we're going to retaliate? This is not a record you can be proud of. It was just infuriating that there was this description of him and his record as governor. And to me, that's what matters the most. You alluded to also this perception that he's a centrist, and not. He's very hard left. You can make the argument that as a member of Congress, he was on the more centrist side of House Democrats. But his vote share kept shrinking, election by election. In 2016, he won by 1%. The Republicans won at the next cycle. He chose to run for governor. Oh, by the way, missed about a third of the votes his final 2 years in Congress. Don't tell me about your work ethic when you can't show up to the day job you have. If you really want to if you don't want to show up to work, resign, right? That most people would say that's the honorable thing to do. Don't keep collecting that congressman's paycheck while you're running for governor and just not do the job. But so Walz did that. And ironically, running for governor as a Democrat in Minnesota is an easier path than it would have been to run for re-election in that fairly purple turning red district down there. So I also think the fact that so much of this is not known to the American people, kind of dropping the ball there, Trump campaign. I know you got a lot to do. I know there's a lot, but somebody really needed to go out and say, this is the real Tim Walz. Kamala Harris made an awful choice, and they're going to try to sell him to you as the coach from Hoosiers and Red Green and a Wilford Brimley character. And that's not who the guy is. Or at least, that's the pose he wants to be, but that's not how he's governed, which really should be the most important aspect in considering the choice before us.
Yeah, and he didn't mention any of his 30 trips to China. It's amazing.
Right,
that didn't come up in the speech. And then the last thing I'll say about Tim Walz is they like to point out that he's an avid hunter. If the first thing they say when they say they don't worry about me on guns is I'm a hunter, run in the opposite direction. I promise you that is nothing to do with what the founders meant by the Second Amendment. And also, always pay attention at the Democratic Convention or any Democratic speech. The very first word after I support the Second Amendment is always but. Every time.
I checked the Second Amendment. There's no mention of elk. There's no mention of deer, no mention of moose, which based on my encounter earlier this year, I feel like there really ought to be.
Yes.
Again, we've seen this. Remember when John Kerry went on the hunting trip with the, it just kind of looked ridiculous. I know they were going to try to soft pedal his record and they're going to, go into the folksy persona, but they were really shameless about that last night.
Oh, no question about it. No question about it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the second martini as well. All right, Jim, last night at the DNC, it was Freedom Night, protecting our freedoms. And so there's a lot of different freedoms. We could have talked a lot about the things in the First Amendment, especially, freedom of speech, which the Biden administration tried to squelch on social media. We talked about the Second Amendment, whole Bill of Rights, 10 amendments, a lot of things in the Constitution they could have talked about. We didn't really have time to get to that, though. We had a lot of other things to talk about. So first of all, here's Walz talking about what Republicans allegedly consider freedom and what he considers freedom.
When Republicans use the word freedom, they mean that the government should be free to invade your doctor's office. Corporations free to pollute your air and water. And banks free to take advantage of customers. But when we Democrats talk about freedom, we mean the freedom to make a better life for yourself and the people that you love. Freedom to make your own health care decisions. And yeah, your kid's freedom to go to school without worrying about being shot dead in the hall.
Yeah, it's the Democrats who are not the party of mandates and severe regulations. But let's see if you can figure out from some of these other clips also about what freedoms they care about most. Here's Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania.
While he cloaks himself in the blanket of freedom, what he's offering isn't freedom at all. Because hear me on this, it's not freedom to tell our children what books they're allowed to read. No, it's not. And it's not freedom to tell women what they can do with their bodies.
I think you played the wrong audio. That's Barack Obama. That's not Josh Shapiro. Oh, I'm being told that is Josh Shapiro. He'll be playing Obama on the next season of Saturday Night Live. I'd heard when there was all the Veep speculation, people say, God, he sounds like an Obama impersonator. I'm like, no, he did. And then I heard, like, oh, yeah, there it is. Okay, yes, he does sound like Barack. He sounds like a guy doing a Barack Obama impression.
Exactly.
Let me be clear.
Right. Hear me now.
Hear me now.
Here's Oprah.
People who want to scare you, who want to rule you, people who'd have you believe that books are dangerous and assault rifles are safe. That there's a right way to worship and a wrong way to love. If you do not have autonomy over this, if you cannot control when and how you choose to bring your children into this world and how they are raised and supported, there is no American dream.
So basically, they're focused on making sure your kids have access to graphic porn in their school libraries and they have a chance to terminate the pregnancies of your unborn children. Oprah did talk about, I think it was a great story about Tessie Williams, who benefited from the Brown versus Board education decision and the difficulty she had integrating the school her parents wanted to send her to in New Orleans. But somehow nobody last night had the time to talk about giving parents now the power to send their kids to the school they want. So, Jim, beyond that, the Democrats suddenly love small town America. They love flannel. Do you ever think Barack Obama would be extolling flannel at a Democratic convention? It's just amazing. Tim
Walz, we trust women to make their own healthcare decisions. Unless it's a vaccine, then if you don't,
right.
Under Walz, if you worked for the state government of Minnesota, you could get the vaccine, you could get tested once a week, or you could quit. Those were your options, right? But also, you notice how much there was bashing of Big Pharma last night? Less than 3 years ago, if you didn't take Pfizer or Moderna, you was like, all right, that's you're persona non grata. We will cast you out of society for like a year if you did not get the vaccine, if you'd already had it, if you didn't feel like it. Oh my God, you're this absolute nut job. You're this dangerous extremist. You're Aaron Rodgers. And you deserve to have your Achilles tear. That's, because vaccines strengthen your Achilles. That's apparently the lesson we're supposed to take away from that. And now it's like 3 years later, pharmaceutical companies are terrible and greedy and trying to poison you and try to destroy you. Oh, but also Robert F. Kennedy, who may be leaving the race on Friday. He's still a dangerous extremist, right? Do you notice that there's this utter constant contradictions here? And nobody seems to be all that bothered by that. Look, the Democrats' entire concept of freedom is abortions, which there are a whole bunch of people who believe is either akin to murder, is murder, or is too close to comfort for murder, particularly in the late stages of pregnancy, to be permissible and allowed in society. And that your kids should be able to get gay porn in the school library. That's their entire definition of freedom. That's, all that kind of stuff. Your economic freedom, your tax rate, tax everybody to death, regulate everybody to death, a million rules. We're going to do curfews. We're going to do, you can't leave your house during COVID. But but we're the pro-freedom party. Okay, Now, are there ways in which Donald Trump is less than ideal for promoting the message of limited government? Yes. Is there this whole nationalist populist turn in Republican circles? Is it a little less pro-liberty? Oh, yes. These guys are not libertarians. The idea that the Democrats are the pro-liberty party are kind of, it's just, how about free speech? How about, these people believe you should be fired if you post something on social media that is sufficiently controversial. They want the government. Well, the government's not telling Twitter to take down these posts or Facebook. They're just requesting, and the social media companies are obeying. Just utterly absurd here. But again, it's a very curious definition about how the very limited, narrow range in which the Democratic Party defines freedom and a much broader range, maybe one that the Republicans could emphasize more, that they see freedom and everything else. But you have to join a union. You absolutely have to join a union, but you're free. Yes.
The freedom to join a union, not the freedom to decide whether you want to join.
That's the opposite. He's anti-right to work. Like right to work is you have a right to work there, and if you want to join a union, there's a union. Go right ahead. If you don't want to join a union, go right ahead. Like that's freedom. And it says no. Freedom means being forced to do things by the government. That is where we're at right now.
So yes, on the freedom front, this convention has been pure fiction in so many different ways. And Jim, I can't think of anyone better to sum this up than Bill Clinton, who said this, referring to Barack Obama back in 2008. But I think these words encapsulate how you and I pretty much feel about what the Democrats are trying to shovel this week.
Give me a break. This whole thing is the biggest fairy tale I've ever seen.
From the Egyptian pharaohs all the way to Richard Nixon, what Kamala's plans are dangerous. The Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski. Every day, Chris helps unpack the connection between politics and the economy and how it affects your wallet. It is never a good idea to implement price control. It has a proven track record of making matters even worse, and in some cases, end civilizations. Whether it's happening in D.C. or down on Wall Street, it's affecting you financially. Be informed. Check out the Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast.
All right, Jim, on to our crazy martini now. And for that, it's still a convention story because it happened there, but it's not directly related to what we saw on the podium. Yesterday, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo was speaking with ABC News, and ABC News asked her about the report that we talked about in our second martini yesterday about how the Bureau of Labor Statistics had to revise the number of jobs created down 818,000 from March 2023 to March 2024. And so Gina Raimondo, first instinct is to blame Trump for this report, and then to claim that she has no idea what the ABC News person is asking her about.
When you hear that, do you potentially think that this new numbers could be a liability for this campaign?
No. When I hear that, first of all, I don't believe it because I've never heard Donald Trump say anything truthful.
It is, though, from the Bureau of Labor.
I'm not familiar with that.
So, Jim, she is one of the cabinet secretaries who should be focused primarily on the economy. So one of two things is happening here. Either she does know what's happening and blaming Trump was her knee-jerk instinct, even though he had absolutely nothing to do with this, or number two, she's not really sure what's happening in our own government right now.
Greg, this came out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is part of the Department of Labor. Raimondo is the Secretary of the Department of Commerce. Totally different departments. She can't be expected to know these sorts of things. Commerce and labor have nothing to do with each other. There's absolutely unreasonable for them. Okay, so a couple things. First of all, my colleague Dominic Pino, who knows all kinds of stuff about economics, lays out and says, look, there's no evidence this is a surreptitious plot. Right, this is something that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does every year. It's basically they go back and check, because economic data is always coming in, and some data comes in faster than others. And so when you give up the monthly report, it's like, this is our best sense of how it is now. Time goes by, you get more complete data, and then they revise it. And then they do a big annual, all right, everything in the last year, how do we know it? And this is a full revision. There had been rumors for a couple of days that it was going to be up to 1 million jobs. It wasn't 1 million, but 818,000, that's a lot. That's 80% of what they were saying. And kind of wipes out a huge chunk of the job, not all, but a significant chunk of the jobs created. Oh, by the way, government jobs were revised upward. Right, so more people are working for government, fewer people working in the private sector. This is indisputably bad news. And one more, kick in the crotch to the idea that, Biden has been having this roaring economy and why isn't he getting more credit or something? All of the coverage, for several years now, but in particular the past year, there's been this sense of the economy is doing great. Why are Americans so gloomy about it? Why aren't Americans giving Biden credit for it? And you look at these numbers maybe the American people had a better gut sense of how the economy was doing than the actual Bureau of Labor Statistics. Again, nothing surreptitious or sinister about this. This is part of a regular process the Bureau of Labor Statistics does. But it's a really big miss. And I can't begrudge anybody for looking at that and saying, are we sure you guys didn't want to make the numbers look as good as possible heading into an election year? Anyway, you want to add it up, though. This is still, bad. And it still is this... this sort of thing you'd want to ask questions of the nominee. You'd want to ask questions of the vice presidential nominee, but they don't do that anymore. They apparently they don't have to do that. They're never going to do any questions. So the only people you can ask are the cabinet officials who are unlucky enough to get up on camera. And Raimondo's whole thing is like, this is a vast conspiracy. No, it's not a conspiracy theory. The conspiracy theory is coming from inside the House. It's coming from the Department of Labor. So, I don't know if there's necessarily a good answer where you could say, the great news is that's more opportunities to create more jobs in the future or something. Or, like there really wasn't. It was a bad spot. And I think she just, flailed around for the first thing to come to mind. Donald Trump's a liar. That's what you get there. And I think we, the American people, have left, right, or center, have a right to expect and demand better than simply insisting any new information, any data that we don't like must be a lie.
Exit question, Jim. The Democrats are now 0 for 3 in getting their featured speaker into primetime each night of the convention. Will they get one tonight?
No, based on that. Let me point out, I'm not supposed to be on CNN tonight. But I was supposed to be on CNN's post. I assume not the first panel. I assume I'm the B team panel. Both nights I got bumped. I'm not like raging about it. I really prefer just to get to bed. But it's just kind of this, as soon as the football team came out for Tim Walz last night, I'm like, they're not having me on. And like a moment later, I get the email, Jim, we're sorry. Would you like to send a car to help get you home? Yes, thank you. It used to be the opening nights, the networks would do like 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern. Mm-hmm. And then on like the final, the night of the vice presidential nominee and the presidential nominee, then they do it from about 9 p.m. to 11, because the networks still wanted to have the regular broadcast coverage, the sitcoms, the all the other shows, and they didn't like giving up prime time hours for political because the ratings were usually down. Kids, this is back when broadcast television mattered.
Yes,
it's a completely different world, and I suppose the idea for the Democrats is, most of this stuff gets seen on social media the next day everywhere. Mostly it's a 2 to 3 minute clip at the longest, maybe just a 20-second, 30-second clip floating around on Facebook Reels or TikTok because the Chinese government likes it, or some other aspect of it. So it doesn't matter when anybody goes on. I don't think that's true. There's a certain portion of Americans who do watch this. It's going on. Most of the summer television program is in reruns anyway. And so, okay, let's watch it. And I undoubtedly believe that the East Coast is not exactly unpopulated. And it's not exactly like places like North Carolina and Georgia and Pennsylvania. And correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, your old home state of Michigan, that's in Eastern Standard Time. It's East Coast time,
everything
right?
Except the Upper Peninsula counties where I grew up, bordering Wisconsin, but most of it's Eastern.
All right, so that's a whole bunch of people who you want to see your best speakers. And I just figure you'd want them to be taking the stage around 10 p.m., at the latest. They don't buy into that. They're perfectly fine with Tim Walz speaking after 11, with Barack Obama speaking after 11, and with Joe Biden speaking after. Like, Joe Biden makes sense. Like, okay, we don't want anybody to watch Joe Biden. We don't want to remind people. Like, I can understand the logic behind that one. It's a little kind of a stab in the back to the old president, but fine. So, Mike, there's no reason to think Kamala Harris will speak before 11 tonight, and I don't get that. One, because it makes me stay up later and I don't like it. But two, why would you not want people on the East Coast to watch this? I don't get that. I don't, and the other thing that kind of communicated by this is this fear. Look, if we don't allow Gina Raimondo to speak, the whole convention's a disaster. Or you can't expect Kathy Hochul, Chris Coons. These are people who America needs to hear from. If you don't have Amy Klobuchar, what's the point of the evening? Now, I'm going to point out last night, because I'm covering this convention, I'm in the arena. Literally, if I'm any higher, I'm going to bump my head on the ceiling. The National Review is on the very last row, and we are almost behind the speaker. So don't think that I've got a good seat. But I can say I have seen Stevie Wonder perform live, and that was awesome. So that was what's the best part of the convention? John Legend was good too. What's his name? Lil Jon, during the roll call of the states. My only disappointment was that I really thought the chair should have said that his report of the votes of the Georgia delegation has been turned down. Some listeners are like, "Why? Okay, what's so funny about that?" Lil Jon's biggest hit is turned down for what? And so if he had just you're turned down for what? It would have been very funny. But anyway, he performed it. It went very well. So I give credit to the Democrats. They've had fun. I don't know if this will make people want to vote for Kamala Harris more, but it's a weird convention that feels like it's being geared towards the West Coast time zone, which doesn't make any sense because those three states always vote Democratic anyway. Maybe they're really trying to win over Alaska this year.
I think you put your finger on it. I think they want 20-second snippets of Harris and Walz rather than having people watch them for 30 or 40 minutes, because I think they don't trust them to be out there in prime time.
Yeah. And one other thing, and again, this is like damning Tim Walz with faint praise. It was like 16, 17 minutes of his speech. It was fine. That was really all that was needed, even though I'm pointing out there was like, this air, his record was airbrushed in a wind tunnel. But like almost all of the speakers are anywhere from, like, in my mind, a third to half longer than they needed to be. That there's a whole bunch of stuff that's repetitive. We've now had several Republican guest speakers calling the Republican Party a cult. Bring them out at the same time if they're going to have the same. It almost feels like there hasn't been a lot of coordination of who's talking about what. We've had several folks doing shtick about Project 2025. Keaton Thompson from Saturday Night Live. It was very funny. It was a good enough segment. But I feel like I've seen this again. Probably most people don't watch the whole thing the way those of us who are professionally obligated do so. But it just ends up with a lot of the same stuff, and I just don't get. I guess maybe they think repetition is part of the effectiveness of their messaging, but it ends up being kind of a long, dragging slog of a convention. Which these are the choices I've made, Greg.
So it's big time fiction going on at the DNC. The question is whether it will work, and we'll find out in due time. So, Jim, rest up for the final day. Talk to you tomorrow.
One more night, Greg. See you tomorrow.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast if you don't already, and also to tell your friends about us. Thanks for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch Podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a terrific Thursday and join us again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.